Reporting live here with Kevin Trejchel. He's got some important news to tell us today.
In this past year, July of 1962, the Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, began to build 42 missile sites in Cuba. John F. Kennedy demanded the removal of these missiles and also announced a naval blockade around Cuba. Today, a spy plane discovered these 42 sites in Cuba and reported back to John F. Kennedy, who declared that these sites are way too close to the United States mainland and was seen as a threat to all Americans that lived in the U.S.
States that representatives of the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain will sign this limited nuclear test ban treaty, which will prohibit testing of nuclear weapons in outer space. You agree in this treaty?
I do indeed.
This map here is showing the Cold War in Europe. The following colors represent: orange represents the Warsaw Pact, green represents the NATO nations, yellow represent neutral nations, and the red line represents the Iron Curtain.
During the Cold War, there was another union that was created between all of the developing nations, often newly independent, who were not aligned with either superpower, the United States, or the Soviet Union, that were called the Third World. These non-aligned countries provided yet another arena for competition between the two Cold War superpowers. The United States, Soviet Union, and in some cases China used a variety of techniques to gain influence in the Third World. They backed wars of revolution, liberation, and or counter-revolutions. The U.S. and the Soviet Union intelligence agencies, the CIA and the KGB, engaged in various covert or secret activities ranging from simple spying missions to assassination attempts on each other's main leaders. The U.S. tried to gain the upper hand by giving military aid, building schools, and setting up programs to combat poverty in these third world nations. In 1955, it hosted many leaders from Asia and Africa at the Bandun's Conference, and they met to form what they called a third force of independent countries or non-aligned nations. After World War II, rapid industrialization, population growth, and a lingering gap between the rich and the poor led Latin American nations to seek aid from both superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. involvement in Latin American nations began long before World War II. American businesses backed leaders who protected the U.S. interests, but who also often oppressed their people.
The Cold War was a state of political and military tension. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against Axis powers. The first modern arms race took place when France and Russia challenged the naval superiority of Great Britain. Supported by Soviet arms and money, and fears with the U.S. re-engaging on a promise to provide funds for the construction of the Aswan Dam on the Nile River, Nasser ordered the Suez Canal seized and nationalized. The space race was a competition of a Cold War between the U.S. and USSR. The U.S. was very shocked with the Sputnik's launch, and they ended up using many satellites to spy on one. The USSR shot down a U-2 spy plane and captured its pilot. President JFK was forced to admit to the Soviets that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, had been flying spy missions over the USSR territory for years. A pair of Allied peace conferences at Yalta and Potsdam determined the fate of Germany's territory.
Oh, hello! Today we are in wonderful Cuba, and it's the forecast for today is a little cloudy with a chance of rain, which it is doing right now. And it's making it very hard for the United States satellites to be able to see the missiles that the Soviet Union has began to build in Cuba, and it's a big problem for the United States because they really can't detect what they're doing down there. So, thank you for the weather, and now back to Andrew at the station.
How the Hockey Talk with Andrew Bruno and Kevin Trejchel.
How do you guys even score in hockey?
Half clapper, top chatter.
Biscuits, top corner, Bradonskis.
Always Baranskis.
Pull out the guns, safety off.
Frickin' safety off,
Little
boys.
3-on-1 ski,
Little 3-on-2 ski.
from a high hard one.
Hit the red light district.
Jesus Christ.
Yes!
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this